Good morning. We are about to get started officially. My name is Daniel Kaufmann. You know me as Danny Kaufmann. It's my pleasure to welcome you here and together with Tony and Paul to open this conference, the annual Charter Conference. We'll be explaining much more there, but without further ado, I want basically to give the floor to Paul Collier, who doesn't need any introduction, who's going to give a keynote speech followed by a Q&A. But before that, actually, Tony, who's co-opening with me the conference, will make also some remarks, and then we'll go to Paul. So, Tony.
Yeah, I'm really not going to make any remarks except to say who I am. I'm Tony Venables, the director of the Oxford Centre for the Analysis of Resource-Rich Economies, OXCAR. Let me welcome you all to Oxford. Draw your attention to the fact that OXCAR is an academic research centre on looking at the particular problems of resource-rich economies and has its annual conference starting tomorrow and running through into Saturday. So there will be a bunch of 30 or 40 academics joining you for dinner, and hopefully there'll be interaction. It really is important, I think, to get interaction between the research community and the more policy community. So tonight at the dinner and then running through, I hope that will happen. So welcome to Oxford. Paul is the keynote speaker. I'm going to hand over to him straight away. I think he's going to speak for around 20 minutes, then time for Q&A. But then Danny wants to speak for 20 minutes or so about the new organisation. So we will surely overrun, but I hope by not too much. Paul.
I'm going to start with running through why harnessing natural resources for mass prosperity is difficult, and then turn to what has to be done about it. And natural resources are obviously a big opportunity. They become a very much bigger opportunity in the last decade, partly because the level of commodity prices has broadly gone up, and partly because that triggered a wave of exploration over the last decade. So that, and a lot of that exploration was in poor countries, because poor countries had been the least prospected. And so the coming decade, we've really got a conjunction of two effects which are giving much bigger revenues in the coming decade than we had, say, in the 1990s. One is that the level of prices is quite a lot higher, and the other is that there's a big quantity expansion in the poorest countries. So natural resources loom very much larger in the economies of poor countries in the coming decade than they did a decade ago. Now that is a huge opportunity. For the first time ever, many poor countries are actually in a position to apologize. For the first time ever, many poor countries are actually in a position to develop with their own money. They're not beholden to the pantomime of donors and all that sort of stuff. So they've got their own resources. And why it's so important is that that may just be a moment. It might not last that long. I think of it as a one-generation opportunity. It may turn out to be longer than one generation, but it may not. Some of those resources will physically deplete over the course of the next generation. Many countries have found relatively small oil fields which will last a couple of decades and then that's it. And we also have no way of knowing what's going to happen to commodity prices. As technologies change, some resources become technologically obsolete. And so we can really only count on high revenues for a generation. And so it's a moment. It's a moment of opportunity and responsibility in poor countries. I'm going to look at the economic decision chain and then why that is politically so difficult. So the economic decision chain is itself really complicated, and it cuts across a lot of different activities. So if we think about what does it take to harness natural resources for sustained prosperity? First, you've got to discover them. They're hidden under the ground. And the process of discovery is an application of the economics of information. Now, the economics of information has been a huge growth area, pioneer area in economics over the last 40 years. And indeed, the chairman of our technical council, Michael Spence, got his Nobel laureate, Nobel Economics Prize, for his work on pioneering work on the economics of information. The basic message of all that work is that the private market in information doesn't work very well. Basically, information is a public good, and there's an inescapable role for good public policy to manage the process of information generation. In a nutshell, it means governments need to invest in public geological information. Know what you've got. That's the discovery process. Big role for public policy, complicated. Then there's the taxation process. I won't say much about it because we've got some of the world's experts here in the audience, which does not include me. But the natural resources generate large rents as well as profits. Rents are not a return on factors of production, they're intrinsic value. And those rents belong to citizens. But in accounting terms, rents are just bundled up with profits. And so the first, as it were, possessor of those rents is the resource extraction company which takes them out of the ground. In that role, resource extraction companies have a custodial role of other people's assets. And in that sense, they're a little bit analogous to banks. Banks are custodians of other people's assets. And we've learned the hard way over the last 50 years that because banks are the custodians of other people's assets, they better be subject to a higher level of regulation, both national and international, than just ordinary manufacturing companies. Natural resource extraction companies are also the custodians of other people's assets. In poor countries, the custodians of very poor people's assets. And so they too need to be subject to a higher level of regulation and scrutiny than an ordinary manufacturing company. And most definitely, they need to be subject to a different tax regime because the tax has got to capture the rents, it's got to transfer the rents. Companies, of course, must earn a good return on the capital and the risk and the skills that they deploy, but the rents belong to citizens and taxation is the vehicle for that. Taxation is difficult because of, again, information, asymmetric information. The company and the government have asymmetric information. And so there's a real challenge of trying to breach that asymmetry. The basic principle, I think, is tax what you can observe, and if you're going to tax it, build the capacity to observe it. So there's no such thing as a perfect tax system independent of the capacity to implement it. And so the capacity and the tax design have to go together. But there's a further problem in taxation, which is that investment is a massive commitment by companies. And so companies naturally and quite appropriately are worried about whether there's a hold-up. Once they've sunk the investment, does the tax environment change? And getting appropriate levels of commitment is really difficult. And that appropriate commitments from government and appropriate technologies that deliver those commitments is a really major issue. That's perhaps the main reason why, as of the millennium, there was so much less discovery of natural resources in poor countries than in rich ones. So we discover, we tax, and then we deal with the local. Natural resources always come out of the ground somewhere, not everywhere. And that creates three possible interfaces that can go wrong with the local population. One is environmental. Can we compensate for unavoidable environmental costs? Can we limit environmental damage? The second interface, where there's a lot of fuss, is whether the local can sell inputs into the company. And my own sense there is that we need a sense of realism there, that probably there aren't that vast opportunities in most instances. But there's a third interface which I think is neglected, which is that companies in extracting resources, for that process of extraction, they need infrastructure. They need electricity, they need water, they need railways, and it's possible to design those things in such a way that benefit the local community or indeed a whole development corridor. And I think moving corporate social responsibility from an approach which said, we'll build a school and a clinic, we'll do nice things, we'll pretend we're a charity, to a much more viable structure in which the very things that the company needs for its own activities are shared and assist the local economy. That seems to me a much more viable and sustainable narrative. Moving on down the decision chain comes the balance. Once you've got revenues in, what are you going to do with them? And a key balance is between spending them on recurrent consumption and spending them in such a way as builds the future. Because you're depleting a natural asset, there's a responsibility to use a substantial proportion of those revenues to build the future. Tony has actually pioneered work here on trying to sort out what is that sensible proportion. In a nutshell, it's that it's going to be substantial, it's going to be less than 100% of revenues should be invested for the future, but certainly a substantial amount, maybe 50%, that sort of thing. And then we come to the bit where, even if you get that far, things usually go wrong, which is if you're going to invest, say, 50% of your revenues for the future, how do you do it? And the siren which beckons poor countries is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. 50 countries have asked the Norwegians for advice. Now, what the Norwegians do, that Sovereign Wealth Fund, is very sensible for Norway and would be really foolish for poor countries because they're in a very different situation from Norway. Norway has more invested capital per member of the labour force than any other country in the world. And so adding yet more to the capital stock in Norway isn't a great idea. It's better for the Norwegians to own capital in China or Brazil. But if you're from a poor country, you're not Norway yet. Norway only started its sovereign wealth fund once it was already rich. So first get rich and then do a sovereign wealth fund. And now the tough bit. To get rich, you've got to invest domestically But if you start poor, you start without the capacity to invest well. You've no experience of that. And so a central task, I think of it as the central task in harnessing natural resources for development, is to build that capacity to do good domestic investment. It's what I call investing in investing. And I haven't got time to elaborate on that, but building that capacity is really important. There's a good little index put out by the IMF called the Public Investment Management Index, which benchmarks 4 aspects of the public investment process, just scores them for a load of countries. And so any country which discovers natural resources, a good starting point is, what's my current score on that index? If I've got a bad score, which I probably have, then I need to build the capacity to invest well. Unless I build the capacity to invest well, I can't do the domestic investment. And if I can't do the domestic investment, I can't develop. So that's the economic decision chain. Public geological information, tax what you can observe, build the capacity to observe what you're going to tax, deal properly with the local so the local gets sustainable benefits of economic participation, save a substantial proportion, or that is, to devote a substantial proportion of revenues for the future, and build the capacity to invest so that you then push those savings through that investment process and build a better future. That's the economics. Why doesn't it happen very often? It doesn't happen because politically that is really difficult. All the way along the line it's difficult. But let me single out as difficult 2 steps. One is putting money in for the future rather than the present. You discover oil or something glamorous, the default option is an explosion in local expectations. We're rich, we want it now. And that has to be countered. Political leaders think that their core job is to take decisions, but actually their core skill is communication. Politicians get to the top by being good communicators, and that's what they have to do. My favorite example of good communications is the first president of Botswana. Botswana harnessed its diamonds to be the fastest growing economy in the world. And Cicero Tsikama's message to the population was, we're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. Sounds very simple, but what it meant was we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to work our way out of poverty. Tanzania discovered gas 2 years ago. I talked to the commissioner for the region where they'd found the gas. He said, local youth are going around saying, we're rich, we don't need to work anymore. Exactly the opposite of we're poor, we need to carry a heavy load. And so it's an inescapable task of leadership to build those expectations that are realistic and patient. Otherwise, you just throw a party, a consumption party, and you don't build a future. Ordinary people, even poor people, are perfectly capable of thinking about the future because they have children. And a standard behavior around the world is for poor parents to sacrifice so that their children's lives can be better. Right? That's what my parents did for me and probably yours for you. Right? So there's no great difficulty for a poor country being prudent about the future. But that message has to be built because the default option with natural resources is the opposite. We're rich. So it's difficult getting that long horizon. It's especially difficult in democracies. Democracies are really focused on the short term. The typical OECD country has not been able to build a very long time horizon for economic planning. Basically, most governments don't look much further than the election. But in poor countries with natural resources, you have to look, your horizon has to be a generation. And that's demanding. It's something that households can do, but governments are disinclined to do. So the problem is not people. The intrinsic problem is not people, it's government. So that's one area of real difficulty, using resources for the future, not the present. And then the other area of real difficulty is building that capacity to invest well. And the heart of that, I think, is selecting good projects and implementing them well. You can buy in good project design. There are loads of consultancy companies can do good project design. You cannot buy in good project selection because project selection is a political decision. And if the political decision is based on folly, you will waste your money. And so there has to be a process of whereby the political decision uses good technical information. And those decisions, based on good technical information, are protected from the rent seekers who want to advantage themselves. And that is politically hard, to have a big expansion in investment that preserves and enhances the quality of investment. So that's the challenge. Let me conclude with what I see as the key political ingredients in managing that. And there are four components: rules, institutions, a critical mass of citizen understanding, and a unified authorizing environment. Just let me say what I mean by each of them. Rules. Rules may be legislation or they may be policy rules. Just something that a minister announces. This will be our policy rule. The key thing is that they should be public. Rules provide guidance and consistency in decisions, and once they're clearly articulated and become public, they also provide a little bit of discipline, because in order to breach the rule, whoever's breaching the rule has to explain why they're doing that. They have to justify it. So having a decision rule is a good idea. By institutions, I mean the teams of people who actually implement rules, who actually do things. Rules don't get followed automatically. You need dedicated teams of people with a mandate and capacity, and teams that are effective in actually doing things. And those teams have to be built, and it's hard. All along that decision chain, that natural resource decision chain, you will need specialist teams to do things. If you're going to build public geological information, you will need a team that is tasked with doing that and mandated. If you're going to tax resource extraction companies effectively, you will need a tax authority with the capacity and the mandate to do that properly. And you shouldn't be taxing with 5 different agencies. You should have a unified agency that does it. If you're going to deal with the local, you will need local government capacity. If you're going to invest well, you will need a government unit that manages the public investment process well and builds that cost and benefit information and is empowered to take decisions. So you will need a lot of specialist units. So you'll need rules, you'll need institutions. You will need a critical mass of citizens who understand what those rules are for and what those organizations are for. Because unless you've got a critical mass of citizens who understand, those rules and those organizations are just bits of paper. They will get blown away. My favorite example of why rules and institutions are not enough is the euro. Not about natural resources. It's 2 fiscal rules, 1 institution, European Central Bank, and 17 fine, upstanding European governments. And do you know how many of those 17 governments have followed those 2 fiscal rules for the last 12 years? Anybody want to guess? One. One, the Finns. That's why they're so cross. Huh? They had the rules. They had the organizations. They didn't build a critical mass of citizen understanding. And so the rules just got ignored. They tried to re-establish the fiscal rule about 3 years ago. They brought all the finance ministers to Brussels on a Thursday afternoon, and they stood up and said, from now on, its budget deficit's 3%, we promise. That was the Thursday afternoon. The Friday morning, the Spanish finance minister flew back to Madrid and said, oh, we're not doing it this year. And the key point was that the Spanish population didn't then rise up in protest and say, how dare you breach this rule? The Spanish population just said, thank goodness. Right? So there was no critical mass of support for the rule and the institution. Now that critical mass has to be built, and that is the inescapable task of the political process. It's also the inescapable task of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, because the Charter, the Natural Resource Charter, is the only thing that is out there that is accessible, that sets out that full decision chain in language that is intelligible. And so the Natural Resource Charter is pitched at 2 different audiences. It's pitched at government, so that government can learn what to do, and it's pitched at citizens, so that citizens can gain understanding. You know, in the transparency debate, which has been a major advance, but the transparency debate has sometimes pitched government against citizen. Citizens are there to scrutinize the hell out of government. But in the understanding and implementation of that decision chain, the relationship is not oppositional. For example, unless citizens understand the need to build a future, governments are trapped. They cannot devote a lot of resources to the future. And so building common understanding, government and citizen, is not oppositional. And that the Charter, in trying to help both governments and citizens, is actually not an oppositional thing at all. It's a unified approach. Government and citizen need to understand the same thing in order to be able to jointly drag the country out of poverty. I said there were 4 components, and my last remark is that 4th component, the authorizing environment. And that is the environment within government which has the authority to take decisions about natural resources. And I think it's very important that it be unified and that it include all the relevant actors in government, in particular finance, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Natural Resources, Central Bank, and the Presidency all have to be on the same page. They all have to be part of an authorizing environment. There's a real danger that the effective authorizing environment becomes the first place at which money arrives within the country. If you've got a national petroleum company, as in Nigeria, and the money arrives at the National Petroleum Company's offices, then getting it out of that becomes very difficult. And so authority has to lie above the level of wherever the money first arrives. And that's what I mean by a unified authorizing environment, so that you can look along that decision chain and make sure that each part of it is happening. So that's the decision chain. The political record is not encouraging. We can point to Botswana, we can point to Malaysia, of spectacular successes where natural resources have been a rocket lifting the economy to prosperity. And then there are more cases of the opposite. Our task is to make sure that we do what we can, that the future does not repeat the past. but repeating the past is the default option. If ultimately these are national decision processes, the international community, we're bit players, but we're still important. We have a supportive role. Over the last 15 years, we've had a magnificent achievement on transparency. Without transparency, you don't get to the starting line. But that's what transparency does. It gets you to the starting line. Whether you then develop depends upon implementing that whole decision chain. We now need not only to consolidate the success of the transparency campaign, but to go beyond it and to build that understanding, both in government and citizens, that makes it possible to harness those resources for sustained development. Thank you very much. You want me to stay here?
Let's take a few questions. We're short of time, but that's 5 minutes or so.
Scott.
Yeah.
Excellent remarks. Of course, you focus very heavily, I think, properly on government policy formation, but a big part of this has to do with the policies and approaches of the major developing companies as well. And there I'd like you to focus a little bit on the timeline, because it seems to me a big part of the dynamic is that these major corporate entities focus on putting their flag down all over the world, staking out claims, holding them, and then, frankly, trying to warehouse these claims, not develop them, do the minimum in terms of investment. And this strikes me as a huge management problem for developing countries who are counting on that revenue and who are focused, especially the democratic countries, on a very short time frame.
Yeah, so let me take that. There's actually two components. The first is at the discovery process, and the next is at the extraction process. The ideal for a resource extraction company is to buy prospecting rights and then not use them. Because information has externalities. Sinking wells, mines is costly. And so the first best is you've got your prospecting rights, and then you wait for the neighboring plots to somebody to sink a well. And then if all the wells around you are dry, you don't bother. And if the wells around you strike something, you know your prospect looks pretty promising. That's why if you just leave it to a free market, you get a phenomenon like a gold rush, where for years nothing happens, and then somebody finds something, and then everybody rushes in. So you get one phase where there's too little prospecting, and then another phase where there's too much. Yeah? That's clearly socially suboptimal. And so the prospecting process needs to be managed. That's why when you sell prospecting rights, they need to be time-bound. The company has to be required to actually make an investment in prospecting in a limited time. Some countries do that, some don't. Where they don't, companies are sitting on rights that they've had for 20 years. Then the next stage is get the stuff out of the ground. As you say, there's a temptation for companies just to sort of bank things. And that's no use for government. So part of the agreement has to be a schedule of investment and extraction, basically. I should say that a good resource extraction company recognizes that, that there's a wonderful little book by John Kay called Obliquity, which every resource extraction company chief executive should read. Because what John Kay was the head of the founding director of the business school at Oxford. And what he says is profits should never be the direct objective. Once the CEO starts to say, our objective is to maximize shareholder value, then even shareholders should run for their hills. Yeah? His example is ICI, which for a long time had a mission, we want to be the best chemical company in the world, and they were. And then in the 1990s, they switched to, we want to maximize shareholder value, from which point on, they went in terminal decline and have now disappeared. And the point is, it's not a motivating concept for staff, maximize shareholder value. Whoever got up in the morning to do that? Right? And so you need some mission which does involve generating profits, of course, but which is a more inspiring mission. And resource extraction companies in poor countries have an obvious, inspiring mission. We are the instrument of developing this country. In the process, of course, we will make money, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to sustain our activities. But we can feel good about ourselves because not only are we making money, but we are developing this country. We are the core instruments of that. And that's such an uplifting opportunity, message. Most companies in other sectors don't have that opportunity to internalize such a powerful objective. And resource extraction companies are sometimes rather slow in seizing that.
Okay, time for one more, I think. Yeah, please.
My name is Philip from South Sudan. I'm concerned about one issue, that the less developed countries would have their own resources to, get developed. The way we get our resources is from taxes. And when the companies come in at the initial stage of exploration, they would like to negotiate to the extent that they have a tax holiday. Once you grant them that, then what they would do is to speed up the production within that tax holiday period, and as soon as they've recovered all their investment, they get out without paying the taxes. How do we work out a formula where we can pin them down to pay the taxes within that particular period? Should we reduce the tax holiday period?
Yeah.
Or should we not give them the tax at all?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's some sensational examples of that, absolutely sensational examples of ridiculously long tax holidays and stuff like that. I think the basic principle is to shrink the area for negotiation. So legislate, don't negotiate. Right? There will be an irreducible area of negotiation because you can't legislate for everything. Even when you've negotiated, there's still an irreducible area where contracts are incomplete and you have to learn to live with each other day by day. But the starting point is get a good mining code and subject everybody to it and say that's how those are the rules. You want to be here. There's a mining code. You're all on the same. You're all on the same playing field. Right? It's a level playing field. So legislation is a government's big benefit. It's also a benefit to the decent companies because, of course, even worse than the tax holidays are the deals achieved through bribes. Now, the good companies don't do that, but the crooks do. And so getting a transparent code and living and saying that's what it is good for the good companies and it's good for the government.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're introducing
I'm introduced. I'm very mindful that the toughest challenge to do, which I have had the honor of having many times, is to follow in the footsteps of Paul. Let me get right down to business, because in some sense, so much of this and what I'm going to show is inspired by Paul, but not only by Paul, but by so many who are here. I'm here as the messenger. This reflects the work of all of our staff. We've been working on this and a new strategy for the past year, as well as members of the advisory council, the former advisory boards, and now the advisory council, many of you present here, and our governing board. As you see, this is our new logo of the rebranded organization, which you already know about it, the Natural Resource Governance Institute. NRGI is the acronym, and very clearly, as part of the tagline, we try to flesh out and explain about natural resource. We work in that space, which is oil, gas, and mining, mindful that there are other aspects of natural resource, but that's our remit. And it is the outcome of the merger of the Revenue Watch Institute and the Natural Resource Charter. Just very quickly, many of you may have seen from our last year's release of the Resource Governance Index, and this just shows the extent of the governance deficit or governance challenge. The focus was on transparency and some related governance issues, but basically 80% of the surveyed countries do not come up with satisfactory levels of governance and transparency. We will flesh that out later. It's not a surprise then, and that has been alluded to, that there is a very serious challenge we have in front of us. And what I'm suggesting very quickly and very simply is what motivates our work. If we rewind, we go back to 1990, the share of the poor in resource-rich country was 20%. 80% were in resource-rich country. By current trends, unless governance improves, and given also the headway made in non-resource-rich country, by 2030, the share of the poor in resource-rich countries is going to be half. So this is the magnitude of the challenge. And this is according to the definitions of what countries resource-rich currently, not even taking into account the prospective resource-rich countries coming on stream. So this is another way of putting the same data. Essentially, in resource-rich countries, the trend is stagnant in terms of total numbers of the poor, depending if one looks at $2 a day or $5 a day. We're talking about the bottom billion in many ways that Paul pioneered with his famous book, while the yellow line going down is the non-resource-rich country in terms of poverty decline. So we have a particular enormous challenge in our hands. We also have an enormous opportunity. This is just to put in perspective the magnitudes, and this is 2009 data, I believe, 400 billion in resource rents in sub-Saharan Africa versus $50 billion in aid, ODA. A lot of talk and efforts go into improving the effectiveness of aid, but domestic resources is the game in town. And again, this does not take into account what's going to happen in the future. These two maps, they come from Michael Ross' work, and you see what the major petroleum producers in 2005 on the left and what's expected by 2020. Basically, the continent becomes producers. And I think with the exception of 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, every other one is either natural resource rich or prospectively natural resource rich. And this is to illustrate Africa. It's there. The rest of the world, there are some similar patterns. So that's the why we're here today, but Paul said it much more deeply and eloquently. So let me get into some organizational issues, where we came from and where we are going. So it's really important to recognize this is not a new start. This is building from the enormous foundations laid by many of you who were here, including Karen Lissikers, my predecessors, and on the Natural Resource Charter, Paul, Tony, and many of you that have been working for a very long time on that. So it's extremely important to basically showcase where we came from. For the sake of time, I apologize in advance, I'm not going to go through all the text in the slides. For the sake of transparency, I will share that after this for anybody who wants to go into the details. But basically, the Revenue Watch Institute had that for a long time already experience and core competences being a leader in the development of global civil society movement, providing TA on specific issues to government, pioneering work with subnational governance, global advocacy issues, training, capacity building, and boots on the ground, with real presence on the ground in resource-rich countries. Natural Resource Charter, bringing in an overarching analytical intellectual framework with the best practices and cutting-edge thinking that many of you have been involved to all of that across the value chain, very comprehensively, and engaging with leading academics and practitioners, network leaders in the field, already with some country implementation that has started in Nigeria, now in other countries, including Tanzania, relationships with leading academic institutions, and advanced training. This is our mission statement that has come from much interaction and process of consultation, nothing very surprising, helping people benefit from their country natural resources by promoting accountable and effective resource governance. And I stress these notions and the integration between the accountability side, holding governments accountable, as well as the effectiveness in terms of the policy making on resources, on natural resources. So bringing in and integrating the technical expertise aspect as well as the governance and accountability aspects. So why us? Comparative advantages very quickly, technical expertise and intellectual rigor. We bring some reputation and credibility with a variety of stakeholders, operational presence, the boots on the ground, and some strategies and tools that are tested and honed, which we'll discuss very briefly in a second. The key strategic directions we're taking in the new strategy for the next 5 years is first, getting much more involved in depth at the country level, which also requires being more selective. So selecting a group of priority countries and focusing much more investments in having a coherent strategic country-level approach. Strengthening our global practice in terms of the comprehensive approach to the decision chain, using the charter, but using our core competences on the key areas to focus on. Our empirical based and evidence-driven approach, which is the power of data and analysis. Collective action is critical, so the emphasis on multi-stakeholder approach, but beyond that, collective actions. They are champions of reform, agents of reform within each stakeholder. So moving away from looking at each stakeholder as a different silo or sometimes antagonistic to each other. Civil society, government, parliament, media, also engaging more with the youth, and deepening our engagement with the private sector is very important. Partnerships is crucial. As I mentioned earlier, we met among a group, and I just stress that we try to walk our talk. The most extreme form of partnership is a marriage, and basically we are married. The Natural Resource Charter with a Revenue Watch Institute. But we want to have also lovers and many other types of partners in the future. So this is only the beginning, because at the end of the day, we're still small, And none of us can do this alone. The challenge is so much larger of that. So partnerships are crucial. And I know so many of you represent partner organizations in many, from many parts of the world. The value chain from discovery and deciding to extract, you know them, getting a good deal, managing revenues, investing for sustainable development provides a very good framework for us to start thinking about our areas of work. These are the technical, decision-making aspects of the chain, or stages of the chain. They have to be overlaid by the governance and accountability framework, which is umbrella and absolutely key, both the domestic governance issues and the international governance ones, which are all fleshed out in the charter. On the left, it's basically the same, the same stages. The blue is the more governance accountability one. Domestic governance is building institutions that Paul was talking about, ensuring as well, and that's the other key aspect of the charter in terms of its precept, ensuring accountability and transparency. And then each one of the technical areas, including the exploration, taxation, natural resource company, and so on. And at the end, international governance issues, which are critical, which was alluded to before. The role of international companies, as Scott mentioned, role of international governance actors. So that helps frame to illustrate what we are already beginning to do in terms of the implementation. But we're not fully there yet. And one of the reasons we're together is because we want to elicit feedback. We're going to learn in these 2 days and do so much more together. But just to give a quick sense, and again, I'm not going to read it all, but if we follow those stages we just discussed, domestic resources, foundations for resource governance, the resource governance overlaying the issue first, basically we're already involved in these aspects of delivering transparency and oversight, as well as measurement and data-related issues, using that information. And that relates very much to charter benchmarking, the resource governance index report we have, and we're starting the work for the next one, as well as being very engaged with EITI, mandatory reporting, and so on. The second area was getting a good deal in the chain, which encompasses areas which are key for us, strengthening fiscal systems and contracts, and we will hear about that in different sessions, so I won't elaborate here, but they're very concrete examples of issues we are addressing. Reforming state-owned enterprises. Then the next stage is managing resources revenue, which is basically how to establish transparent revenue management framework, natural resource funds, and so on. Then finally, last but not least, the international foundations for resource governance. And that's basically the governance and transparency norms, including EITI, which we discussed before. But within each one of these stages, what I just illustrated is things that we are already doing and that they built from the past or what have been done in the past. There are also frontier areas where we're getting new work going and where we'll need a lot of feedback and support and collaboration. On domestic foundation for resource governance, the whole issue of supporting government enforcement and monitoring capacity, regulatory institutions, auditor generals, ombudsman, anti-corruption bodies, we're getting requests from that is very important. On exploring resources and deciding whether to extract, this interesting work on natural resource accounting and related that Keith has been involved in, and we're looking into that too. Getting a good deal. There is also frontier work on building on local contact, investing revenues for sustainable development. There are a number of examples, including what Paul was mentioning, investing in investing. As part of that, and it's an area that I personally have felt that there has been a gap, and we have been in discussions of how to strengthen that, is how to understand, map corruption in a much more analytically sound way throughout integrated throughout the value chain, because both manifestations, causes, determinants, factors, and consequences of corruption come throughout the value chain. And this just illustrates the type of malfeasance, misgovernance, and corruption that come through that. Organizations like Global Witness, which is present here, have done tremendous work in exposing that, and Transparency International and so on, but integrating it more analytically and then trying to figure out what can be done to prevent that is critical. So the issue of corruption will become also more prominent, and we'll already have agreed to have a collaboration with Norwegians to work on that in a number of countries. I had mentioned that a key part of the new strategy is a country-focused approach that will have a set of high-priority countries where we are already starting to do, in a number of them, a much more in-depth strategic approach to work, maximizing our impact. We're working with all agents of change. And then we'll have a second tier of more limited engagement, but countries that they may be high impact by having more focused intervention, but they could over time also become country-focused, high-priority countries. This work will all be informed and backstopped by a lot of strategic homework done through this country strategy note based on a very rigorous analysis as to how we're going to do it, what's going to be the approach to the portfolio, what type of partnerships we will have with whom, activities, human, financial resources. We will be responsive to opportunities as they arise. We need that, and that's why this option of having the limited engagement and some flexibility. This is an initial list of priority countries that we have already committed to, and it's agreed with our governing board, and you can see it there in each region, which does not preclude others coming on board in the future, including some that may come from the second tier, which is more limited engagement for now, where there are real opportunities, but not at the highest priority yet. I'm very pleased that representative, very high level from Myanmar is here, are here, as well as from Mongolia, from a number of other countries that are in the priority country list, as well as the more limited engagement, but also important. Again, I promise not to go through this whole slide, but it's to impress upon everybody and ourselves the importance of these multi-stakeholder approaches leading to collective action. So having smart partnership with civil society in this very complex world, new tools to engage with reformist governments, more focus in working with parliaments, as well as working basically with the media, where we have new programs as well. And then, very importantly, engaging much more with the private sector. And last but not least, and this is much newer and we need to do much more in the future, is investing in future leaders by working with the youth. This work with a diverse group of stakeholders is absolutely fundamental to our theory of change. I did not want to bore you with many slides we do have on our full theory of change, but by doing this very quick overview, I hope I'm giving some of the elements where the collective action is very important. Let me conclude just by maybe going back to the future and to the beginning, except that this is a different slide. This comes from our previous work on the worldwide governance indicators and shows the extent of the challenge, where the red line is essentially the trend over time of in controlling corruption in extractive intensive countries. It's a very similar line if we choose government effectiveness, or we choose voice and democratic accountability, or rule of law. Essentially, all governance indicators show, first, a much lower level for extractive intensive countries than for non-extractive intensive countries. And that could be, whether for the whole world or only for developing countries, a very similar trend. Now, the opportunity and the more promising news is that if we start unpacking these countries, there is diversity, and there is a group. Unfortunately, it's not very large, but again, as we had shown at the beginning, there is a group of 5 to 10 countries that are showing that, yes, it can be done. And that's a green line. Those are extractive risk countries that by now do have satisfactory governance. And we see it how over time they have been improving and that their level is even above non-extractive intensive countries. So it obviously can be done. And we go back to the very beginning. This is a resource governance index. And for now, rather than focusing on the 80% and the yellows and the reds, we can focus on the green. There is a set of a dozen countries or so out of the 58. And many are emerging economies and developing countries. It's not just the rich that show that, yes, it can be done. And bottom line is that it matters. And this is part of our earlier research showing that governance does matter. The 300% dividend of good governance, basically a country that has better governance, whether better rule of law, as opposed to middle or worse rule of law or control of corruption, can expect in the long term to have 3 times more in per capita income. One standard deviation difference leads to that in the long term. This not only applies to the world in general, but it applies, and even more so, in the dark blue columns, which are the resource-rich countries. Sometimes there's this myth of this notion that resource richness can compensate for good governance. It doesn't work at all. So it does matter at the end of the day. Now let me just finish with this before feedback and discussions with a word of circumspection. The problem of giving a PowerPoint presentation always is that it portrays a certain message of certitude. It's as if we know it all. And this is all what we are doing and great. The bottom line is that the challenge is enormous and we don't have nearly all the answers. We're trying to get at the questions. I think we have learned something about lessons from failure and what doesn't work. But we'll need enormous help in the future in terms of particularly these new frontiers, some of which I outlined, some of which will come out in sessions that some of our staff and our partners are involved with new research on national oil companies, on oil sales and so on. But there's so much that we still are trying to distill and learn from the likes of expertise from yours and others. So let me conclude with also with a word of doubt, caution, and a bit of humility as to the extent of what we don't know. After all, the challenge today is enormous, and the trends over the past 10 or 15 years in our field has not been the most encouraging. There are successes, and of course, let me conclude by saying that I'm a very proud citizen of a country that's been successful in this, and that is Chile. And that's why I'm very mindful that, yes, it can be done, but there are still too few. So we have an enormous task ahead, but also an opportunity. Thank you very much.
Let's just take 5 or 6 minutes for comments on strategy and discussion with Danny, and I'll bring it to a close. Yeah.
If they can introduce.
Yes, if people could introduce themselves, please. Yeah, just.
Yes, I'm Memuna Tuprat from Sierra Leone. Now, I want to have some comments around the issue of the link between governance and the kind of political systems and processes. In looking at most of the reviews in Africa, in West Africa, there has been a strong correlation between the way in which the politics is being handled and the manner in which the control of natural resources in terms of good governance is going. We found out that in countries, many countries in West Africa, we've got situations wherein we have politics of patronage systems, and then we also have politics that is purely based on along party lines, which to some extent has impact on the wider governance. So in looking at these two trends, there is a very strong link between the kind of political party system and the way it is being delivered and the manner in which the governance resource issues are handled. So I would like maybe your views around some of this. How do you see it operating in very weak countries with weak governance structures? And then how does that differ in terms of countries that have got good resource policies, and then they have systems which the political party systems are also very much transparent and democratic?
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to group sort of three questions together, and then I'll let Danny answer. There's one right at the back.
My name is Zhou. I'm from Myanmar. And I have a question for strategies regarding the larger environmental issues surrounding some of our targeted countries. I think your strategy seems to focus a lot on the in-country partnerships. But for example, my country, Myanmar, comes from a region where the economies in that part of the world is demanding high amount of resources. So it's quite a resource-hungry region where our potential for success depends also on the other countries that are using a lot of resources from the neighboring economies. For example, like in Myanmar case, the cooperation from China and India is also very important for our success in terms of coming up as a resource governance. And then also about the international companies. So what are the strategies in regarding the cooperation of the international corporations in helping some of these countries?
Okay, there's one down here, I think one from there, and then hand back to Danny. So yeah, in front. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm from NEPAD, the African Union technical body. Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering, the merger between the Revenue Watch Institute and the Natural Resource Charter, what will that mean for the approach that you work in the countries? We have a cooperation agreement with the Institute, of course, and we view this work as capacity building for the member states. I know the work in the Revenue Watch has, using the index and reporting, is seen most like a critique of what the governments do. So how do we build, how do we forge together an approach that is supportive to build capacity in member states? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to make this the last one, I'm afraid, but yes, yeah, do should.
Thanks. Johnny West, Open Oil. I just wondered, Danny, if you could talk a little bit to conflict and planetary boundaries, where they appear in this schema, because they seem kind of implicit and edged in a couple of places, but I wasn't getting an impression that they were an explicit part of your paradigm.
Planetary boundaries?
Climate change, use of water.
Oh, planetary. Oh, that our planet. Yeah.
Okay, the very last one.
Again, my name is Philip from South Sudan. I stand to be corrected because I have seen the corruption as one of the criteria of selecting the country to priorities. If that is the case, if I'm improving in controlling the corruption in my country, what would be the incentive for my country to be selected to go to the priority list or the potential list? Are there other criteria you're using or just only corruption? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to preface this by saying Danny's around the next couple of days. There'll be lots of opportunity for bilateral stuff. And urge him to be brief because of that.
Okay, so it will be, I will not be able to do justice, obviously, to that, not only because of the brevity, but also because these are very thoughtful and complex questions, and let's follow up during the rest of the couple of days. Maybe the best way of saying I totally agree with you in the first question about the political systems, I didn't show it for the sake of time, so now I can show it. Basically, in places where voice and democratic accountability are lacking, and that's on one axis, the results on the technical side of whether transparency and disclosure and some other governance aspect, management aspect, natural resources are happening, it's much worse. So there's a clear link between the issues of the politics and the results. And that's why it's so crucial, and you said it, and it's part of our strategy, to integrate the accountability, which basically the political analysis dimension and the political understanding will become crucial. And in terms of what to do, obviously, then that means that there has to be different responses and different tailoring of the approach to a country which has one particular set of political circumstances. And I'm tying it to your last question on corruption too, because it's very much related to this issue, as opposed to countries that are much more advanced in that set. There is no one Bible, and I think we have had discussion in terms of the charter, whether the word precept maybe needs to be reformulated, because it should not connote that there is one size fits all for all countries. The tailoring to the country, and there'll be a lot of discussion in the coming days as to how different countries and different realities will require different responses. And that, let me relate it to the question of corruption and how do we select countries after a very thoughtful approach, using many indicators I mentioned, both quantitative but also consulting with expert staff, the countries themselves. At the end of the day, we are in this field because of the nature of the challenge, and we are working in challenging environments. So it's a combination of very high risk and potentially high reward, but we don't know that, that's why high risk, as well as some more medium risk, but still risk, and perhaps the results expected may not be as large. So we're not going to shy away from countries because there's corruption. I mean, we have to determine that it's possible to work there and collaborate with the different stakeholders so that there is a probability, which is non-trivial, to make a difference. And that's a key assessment there, that there is a demand also from the key stakeholder for working there. But unfortunately, because I'm from Chile, I have to say it would be wrong for us to devote a lot of resources on the Chiles of this world. They are doing fine, and they probably don't need us. We need some Chilean experts and the South-South type of collaboration, and I'll try to bring that in. But we're not going to focus on the Chiles of this world. So that's on that. And the question from NEPAD, again, excellent. That's where, again, the integration is so important, because if we're going to focus at the country level and bring in the charter framework throughout, which needs to be tailored for each country, the benchmarking exercise of the charter, that becomes a tool of engagement with the country itself. The Resource Governance Index is a very important comparative tool across the world, so that the country knows, okay, how it's doing compared with the rest. But the much more detailed work in terms of what to do about this and how to improve, it becomes through the benchmarking, working very much together with the key stakeholders, including the government and civil society in the country. Last but not least, you asked about planetary boundaries, not interplanetary boundaries. Let me just say, we should discuss that much more, but it does raise a question. I didn't have much time in the presentation. As important, and perhaps the most difficult thing when one does an organizational strategy is not what the organization wants to do. There's so many great people, great stuff, great ideas. But the toughest decisions we want not to do, because at the end of the day, we're not selective, we're not large, even after the merger. We're not selective. We are going to spread ourselves too thin and not be successful. So it's really important to be very strategic in saying this is not our core competence and this is not what we're going to do. And some of the issues that you raise, I think, are maybe best addressed in working with our partners. Take the Natural Resource Charter as a benchmarking analytical tool is very important for us to assess all the issues in the value chain. But then, in terms of, after identifying what the challenges are, the country says, we want to have an action program and do reforms in all of these. We're not going to work in all of these. On some environmental issues, I have had discussions already with the World Resource Institute, with the president and so on, and others should come in. On corruption, we should team up more with Transparency International and so on. So which areas basically we focus much more in depth and so on has to be also strategic. And there are some areas that we're going to do much more, and others we're going to rely in the work with partners.